All right, let's talk about one of the biggest, most mind-bending mysteries out there, consciousness. The actual feeling of being alive. It's that little voice in your head, the movie that's always playing. But where in the world does it come from? How does it all work? Well, let's dive in and see if we can unpack this.
I mean, really think about this for a second. You've got this 3-pound lump of, well, wet biological stuff inside your skull, your brain. It's just a bunch of neurons and chemicals. And yet somehow, all of that physical activity creates the feeling of seeing the color red, the taste of your morning coffee, or the experience of just being you. So, how does that happen? That's the billion-dollar question.
Before we can even get close to an answer, we have to make sure we're asking the right question. And for philosophers and scientists who study this, it all boils down to what they call the fundamental mystery, or a little more formally, the explanatory question.
So here's the real heart of the problem. We're trying to build a bridge from the objective, physical world of things we can measure, like neurons firing, to the subjective, totally private world of your inner experience. And it turns out there are two completely different strategies for trying to build that bridge.
Okay, so the first big strategy is basically the classic scientific approach, right? If you want to know how a clock works, you take it apart. This strategy is called reductive explanation.
The core belief here is that consciousness isn't some extra magical ingredient sprinkled on top of the brain. Nope, it's just what the brain does. The goal for these thinkers is to show that once you understand all the physical bits and pieces and how they work together, you've completely explained the mind. There's nothing else left over to explain.
And the reductionists, they have a game plan for this. It's a two-step process. First, they do what's called a functional analysis. They ask, okay, what job is this conscious state actually doing? So for example, the function of pain is pretty obvious. It's to signal that your body's been damaged and to make you pull your hand away from the hot stove. Then comes stage 2. Find the physical stuff in the brain and body that's actually doing that job. In this case, maybe it's a specific type of nerve fiber, called a C fiber, firing away. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Now, this whole reductionist strategy comes in a few different flavors. The most direct one is identity theory, which basically says the feeling of pain is, literally, the C fibers firing. They're the exact same thing. Then there's functionalism, which is a bit more flexible. It says, hey, it doesn't matter what it's made of, it matters what it does. So long as something is playing that pain role, signaling damage, causing you to yelp, then it is pain. And then you get to the most extreme view of all, eliminativism. These guys argue that our everyday ideas like belief or desire are so outdated they should just be thrown out and replaced by pure neuroscience. A pretty wild idea.
But here's the thing. This whole strategy of taking consciousness apart, it runs into a massive problem. A problem so deep, so profound, that some people think of it as a great wall that we can just never get over.
And this wall has a name: the explanatory gap. It's the gap between knowing everything there is to know about the physical brain and understanding the feeling, the subjective quality of an experience. The problem isn't just that we don't know the answer yet. The real problem is we can't even imagine what an answer would look like. How could a physical fact ever explain a feeling?
This is where it all becomes crystal clear. Look, on one side you have the objective, physical facts, stuff like wavelengths of light, neural firing patterns. We can measure all that. But on the other side, you have the subjective, first-person, conscious facts, the actual feeling of warmth or the experience of pain. And no matter how much data you pile up on the physical side, nothing seems to logically guarantee the experience on the other side. Why should light at a 650 nanometer wavelength feel like red? That question, that right there, is the gap.
At the end of the day, this is what it's all about. The explanatory gap is about explaining what it is like to be something, what it's like to see that color, to feel that sensation, to be you right here, right now. And that's where the reductive strategy really starts to struggle.
So, if the first strategy hits a brick wall, what's plan B? Well, this brings us to the second major strategy, which it takes a completely different perspective on what it even means to explain something like consciousness.
This view is called non-reductive explanation, and it basically says, hold on a second. We totally agree consciousness is physical. It comes from the brain, no ghosts in the machine, no magic, but, and this is a really huge but, it argues that you can't fully understand or describe consciousness using only the language of neuroscience or physics. It needs its own separate level of explanation.
So how on earth does that work? Well, it's based on a few really interesting ideas.
First, you've got conceptual autonomy. This just means that a science like psychology gets to have its own useful concepts, like belief or memory, without having to perfectly translate them into physics. Then there's this idea of supervenience. It sounds complicated, but think of it like a dollar bill. The value of that dollar depends on the physical paper it's printed on, right? You can't change the value without changing something physical about the bill or the system. But the value itself isn't just a piece of paper. It exists at a different level, the level of economics, not physics. That's the idea here. The mind depends on the brain, but it isn't identical to it.
I know this all might still sound a little abstract, but there's a fantastic analogy that makes this whole debate just click into place. Let's stop thinking of consciousness as a machine and start thinking of it as music played by an orchestra.
So, imagine your job is to explain a beautiful symphony. How would you do it? Well, you've got two basic ways you can go about this, and they map perfectly onto our two strategies for explaining consciousness.
So check this out. The reductive approach would insist that a true explanation means describing the physics of every single sound wave coming from every single instrument, every vibration, every frequency. And if you can't deduce the symphony's emotional power from that giant list of physical facts, well, your explanation has failed. But the non-reductive view says that's just crazy. To understand the symphony, you need musical concepts, melody, harmony, tempo, rhythm. The language of physics is just the wrong tool for the job. You're completely missing the point. So, where does all this leave us? Well, we have these two powerful, competing visions for how to solve what might be the greatest mystery of our own existence. And let me tell you, this quest is far, far from over.
So let's just quickly recap. On one side, you have the reductive view. Their goal is to completely deduce the mind from the brain. In our analogy, that's like trying to explain the beauty of music using nothing but the physics of sound waves. On the other side, you have the non-reductive view. They say, sure, the mind is physical, but it has its own unique level of explanation, just like music has its own rules and its own language that you need to use to understand it.
And this leaves us with one final, fascinating question to chew on. Is our own consciousness a kind of complex puzzle that, if we just get enough data, we can eventually solve and break down into its component parts? Or is it a fundamental feature of reality that we have to accept on its own terms, something to be described and understood but never fully explained away? The answer, whatever it is going to shape everything from the future of AI to our very understanding of who we are and what our place in the universe is.